is the North Africa Journal, and thank you for downloading this podcast. For more podcasts, information, and user rules, please visit north-africa.com/podcast.
This is Power and Politics, and you are where you need to be.
I'm unable. I cannot leave the honorable soil of my country. I will die a martyr at the end.
We find the actions of the government firing upon its own citizens to be outrageous and unacceptable, and we call on the government to cease this kind of violence immediately.
That was Prime Minister Stephen Harper today commenting on the violent crackdowns in Libya. The government is condemning the violence, as is the UN, but it hasn't announced any action aside from organizing emergency flights to get Canadians out of Libya starting Thursday, along with other countries. But opposition parties are calling on the government to put sanctions on Libya. We've done it before, of course, back in the 90s. The question is, do sanctions work? Should the international community reimpose sanctions on Libya? Let's find out. Joining me now from Toronto is the former Foreign Affairs Minister Barbara McDougall in Brian Mulroney's government and the deputy editor of the North Africa Journal, someone who lived in Libya the last time sanctions were in place, Alessandro Bruno. Good to have both of you. Barbara McDougall, let me start with you. The UN Security Council moments ago just condemned the crackdown on Libya, demanded an end to violence, but didn't reimpose sanctions. You served as Canada's External Affairs Minister in the 90s when the international community did impose sanctions against Libya. Then they were suspended, of course, in 99 and lifted in 2003. Is it time for sanctions again?
Well, I think sanctions are a useful tool. They're a very blunt instrument. If they were going to impose sanctions again, I would prefer to see something directly against Gaddafi and his family. Because it is the people in the street that suffer when sanctions are imposed. They are also very slow to take hold, and we've seen this in a number of instances in the past. But they are an important instrument, and yes, I would like to see sanctions imposed. They only work if the whole world does it. They don't work if one country does it.
Alessandro Bruno?
Having lived under sanctions in Libya, I don't think the idea is good at all. The people who particularly in a government like Libya's, even though the government is crumbling, sanctions put the population make the population even more dependent on the government, and we're trying to get them to create a new structure now. So I don't think sanctions are at all the good idea. They could only hurt. They will also hurt the image of the West in the eyes of Libyans, which have already suffered enough. I think sanctions would be the last thing in my mind right now.
So what do we do, Barbara McDougall? Then what are the options here? Here's a leader allegedly now gunning down his own citizens. We've heard about gunships, no confirmation, but jets gunning down protesters, mercenaries doing the same thing. Seems like obviously an incredibly violent response to this. What should the world do?
Well, they can freeze the assets of the leadership. I mean, there are a lot of little steps, but at the end of the day, there is not a lot that the international community can do, and they have to do it in concert. That's the important thing. I think the neighboring countries can have an impact by accepting refugees and people who are fleeing, and so on. I think that the Western countries, if the pilots that are taking out these military planes and so on, if they land in your country, then accept them and keep them and encourage people to take a stand, as the ambassador of the U.S. did today, so that we can see at the moment a real disintegration in Libya. But we're not dealing with a normal human being at the head of this state. So anything we can do should be directed targeted as closely as possible to Gaddafi himself and the people he cares about, which don't seem to be many.
What about this notion, Alessandro, of, and we heard it today from some MPs, a proposal of a no-fly zone similar to what happened in Iraq, or even a naval blockade?
I don't know. We need to, first of all, a lot of people need to be evacuated out. And there's a lot of, Libya relies on foreign workers for just about everything. It's not just the Western workers that are employed by the oil industry. We're talking about the service industry, and even things as basic as bread. Most bakers are Egyptian, for example, and all workers in restaurants and bars and hotels a lot of them are from Morocco and Tunisia. So you need to, there's a lot of people who need to get out, and I think the country needs to stay open for various reasons.
But who, you know, if indeed Gaddafi himself fell, you got his Western-educated son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, okay? He's been suggested by some as a possible successor. He's expected to hold a news conference in Tripoli later today. But he gave this crazy speech on Libyan TV over the weekend, aligning himself very closely with his father. Who indeed could power actually transfer to in Libya, Alessandro?
Well, actually, I was one of the ones who for a long time thought Saif al-Islam Gaddafi would be the successor. Until I started getting some, well, not just me, but in the last year, the favored son appeared to be Mutasim or Hamis, two of the Gaddafi sons that are closely connected with the security apparatus, particularly the revolutionary committees. And in fact, one of the sons, Hamis, was sent to Benghazi to lead one of these security apparatus forces against the population. Saif al-Islam has on occasion even been sent to London in temporary exile at one point because his newspapers were being overly revealing of some of Libya's problems. He even criticized some of the actions that Libya took against the, you might remember the Bulgarian nurses affair. Saif al-Islam was actually a voice of reason in many of these problems. Now, his speech on Sunday makes me concerned. I don't know, did he give this speech under duress? Was he forced by the security apparatus to give that kind of a speech? Because it did not sound like him. If it was genuinely him, then he's no better than his father.
So,
this is a good example of be careful what you wish for. The Western countries are trying to encourage uprisings in a number of countries, some of which have, at least in the early stages, look as though they will lead to a new wave in those countries. But when these forces become unleashed and Western countries start encouraging them, I mean, God knows where this ends up. It doesn't mean we shouldn't encourage them, but we better be really careful and know what we're doing.
Yeah. That said, one of the people that I wouldn't mind seeing taking over is the current head of the oil company, Shokri Ghanem. He's a Harvard-educated Libyan of one of those Libyans that doesn't really belong to a tribe. He's probably of Turkish descent, the old Turkish elite that ruled Tripoli in the 19th century and 20th century before Gaddafi and before the Italian colonization. And this man, as head of the oil company, also a former prime minister until 3 years ago, because he was seen as too close to the West or too reformist for Gaddafi's taste, could be a good leader. The problem is the way Libya is structured right now, with the tribal balance needing to be restored, and particularly the violence that seems to be, judging by Gaddafi's speech today, it seems to be that he will go down in a, like one of those James Bond villains with the whole ship. Well, he won't relent.
As Barbara McDougall says, be careful what you wish for, because you never know what comes next. Over 40 years of Muammar Gaddafi, we're watching this closely. Very interesting perspective on sanctions and what, in fact, the global community can do. The former Foreign Affairs Minister, Barbara McDougall, and the deputy editor of the North African journal, Alessandro Bruno, who lived in Libya. Thanks, both of you. Interesting perspective as the world struggles to come up with some kind of answer to what's going on in North Africa. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was the North Africa Journal podcast. Thank you for listening.